Hi, I'm Beth, and I've been gardening with native plants for over a decade. And on this channel, I'm sharing my journey transforming my Midwestern yard into a native plant paradise that's not only beautiful, but also packed with ecological function. I'll be sharing updates to my garden as I transform spaces, information about native plants and how to care for them, plus all kinds of other stuff related to plants and gardening. Today, we're continuing our look at how to work with native plants in a traditional suburban landscape. In part one, we talked about how we can harness the visual vocabulary of human environments to make a native plant landscape look attractive and neat. I'll put the link to part one in the description if you want to get caught up. Today we're applying those ideas to a couple of typical suburban front yards and talk about some native plant choices that can work in these type of designs. Before we move on though, I want to clarify something from part one. I think there was a baked-in assumption in that video that native plants look messy, and I think they have that reputation, which was what inspired me to create this series. When I tell people I garden with native plants, I usually hear some kind of response along the lines of, "Oh yeah, I've heard they're great for wildlife." And then some kind of explanation about why they can't or why they don't. And it's usually something to do with their appearance. Like, I'd love to add more natives, but I really like color in my garden. Or I just don't like how messy it looks. But the thing is, you can have color and you can have an attractive garden with natives. So anyway, that's what inspired me to make this series. And then there's the flip side of this that really frustrates me sometimes. Traditional yards planted with exotic species can be ugly, boring, or neglected too. If you choose beautiful plants and design your yard thoughtfully and take care of it, then you will have a beautiful yard, whether it's planted with exotic ornamental plants or with native plants. The difference is native plants have benefits beyond their beauty. I'm not trying to dunk on anyone's yard here. My point is just that I think it's time we re-examined this assumption that natives are messy or less aesthetically pleasing. But maybe the more constructive way to think about this is that there is a massive opportunity here to surprise people with how beautiful a native garden can be. So on that note, I've created 2 front yard designs today that use lots of natives and look great doing it. Let's dig in. For our first front yard, we're taking a formal approach. I see a lot of suburban gardens featuring boxwoods or yews pruned into neat lines, and I suspect that people who love order and neatness are probably the most resistant to adding more natives to their yards. So for our first example, we're going really formal. There's a few reasons that I decided to lean into formality. First, I don't think there's a lot of inspiration out there for formal native gardens, so I figured let's really go for it. Second, I think that formality can actually be a really useful tool for a native garden because it's offering that orderly frame that we talked about in part one for our messy ecosystem. So this is our imaginary house as dreamed up by AI. I was going for a nice colonial style house that you might see in an older suburb. I've learned that getting ChatGPT to make images feels a little bit like that time in The Good Place where Janet could only make cactuses. So apologies in advance for the wonkiness. I make literally everything in these videos, and using AI saved me a lot of time having to draw or Photoshop something. So as you can see, the lawn is expansive. I am pretending this front yard is roughly 50 feet wide and 25 feet deep, and I'm gonna ignore the side yards for now. Our AI overlords, not unlike many human suburbanites, have been programmed to think a row of evergreens plus a giant lawn equals a front yard. And while this ticks all the boxes for a suburban yard, we know we can do a lot better. Even if we didn't care about wildlife or environmental impact, I think we can all agree this yard could actually look a lot better with more plants. We're going to go above and beyond, though, and give this house a formal front yard that is not only ecologically friendly, but it's also going to be so much more attractive. So, most modern gardens are a blend of styles and influences, but the very formal clipped evergreen hedges harkens back to the gardens of the Renaissance, where parterres created an orderly pattern in the gardens of the very wealthy. These evergreen frames were then filled with other plants, and I'm going to use parterres here to frame some of the wildness of the garden. So there's this historic element, which I think will complement the house style well, but I also wanted to incorporate elements that feel more modern as well. I'm starting by laying out the structure of the garden. In a formal design, the structure is clearly expressed through strict symmetry, straight lines, and geometric forms. We're going to use parterres to maximize our native plants while still keeping a really formal look. I'm going to use yew hedges for most of the parterre. No, yews are not native, but I don't personally feel like you have to do all or nothing. There really aren't many evergreens that are native to the upper Midwest where I garden, and yews are not invasive, so they're doing a very specific job, so it's the right plant for this design. So that's what I've decided on here. For the circular portion of the hedge, I'm actually going to interrupt the yew with prairie ninebark. This is a fast-growing shrub with dense foliage that lends itself to pruning, and it's still going to have huge benefits for wildlife, even pruned. And visually, I think it's going to highlight that contrasting form of the curving part of the hedge. Plus, I think it actually looks a little fresher and less old school than just using yew all the way around. In the parterres will be a matrix planting. We're literally putting some messy ecosystem into our orderly frames. In the matrix, I'm going to aim for a mix of plant bloom times as well as a mix of grasses and wildflowers, and I'm going to keep the plant heights and bloom color restricted so the overall effect is not too chaotic. I think because it's surrounded by this yew hedge, I might be able to get away with plants that are a little taller, but I do want to keep things pretty consistent. So I'm going to plant a mix of little blue stem and some side oats grama for the grasses. And then for the flowers, I'm going to try and keep a mix of mostly white and blue till late summer when there are just so many yellow flowers blooming in the prairie. I'm going to put in Ozark Blue Star, Wild Hyacinth, Pale Lobelia, and Ohio Spiderwort for spring to early summer blooms. Then moving into summer, we'll add some mountain mint and anise hyssop, both of which actually have a pretty long bloom period, and they are absolute pollinator magnets. High summer is the time for the more flashy prairie species, and I think we can get away with a little more height from things like foxglove beardtongue, rattlesnake master, purple coneflower, and prairie milkweed. And then as summer turns to fall, we'll bring in some purple-headed sneezeweed, some sky blue asters, and some Ohio goldenrod. Goldenrods are one of the best perennials for supporting wildlife, so I always include them. But for smaller gardens, you may want to deadhead them so that they don't self-sow. So in these circular spaces, I'm going to plant pussy willows, which host an impressive 431 different caterpillar species. They have beautiful silvery catkins in spring, and they will frame the path nicely. Be sure to buy male pussy willows, though, if you want those silver gray catkins. Female trees have different kinds of flowers. And then beneath them, I'll plant some Carex pennsylvanica, which will sort of act as a no-mow lawn. So not mowing is key here under the trees because it's going to keep that soil from compacting and ensure that all our little caterpillar friends have a soft landing to complete their life cycles. I do plan to keep a few feet of lawn as a border around most of the yard because it's one of those cues to care that is going to keep this space looking really neat and tidy along with those tightly pruned hedges. Along the path, I'm going to do a mass planting of prairie smoke. It's going to look amazing. This is a plant that's native to sandy soils, so if you have clay soils, maybe you've dismissed it as an option for your garden. But any paved area of your yard has a base of sand and gravel, which is actually just what this plant needs. So the path acts kind of as a miniature sandy soil ecosystem that the prairie smoke loves. And I think the fluffy seed heads look spectacular in a mass planting like this. The bed along the house is going to get a very austere palette, just little blue stem and anise hyssop. I was thinking of paths lined with lavender for my inspiration here. The mostly grass border is going to feel pretty modern, so I think that a nice contrast would be some planters, maybe with topiary to frame the front door. And then to anchor the corners of this design, I'm going to put choke cherries. These are beautiful trees with white flowers, fruit that wildlife love, also great host plants, and they have gorgeous red-purple fall color. The next yard will also be fairly traditional looking, but it's going to be more of a nature-inspired design. Instead of controlling nature with rigid geometry and pruning, we'll create an idealized picture of nature with groupings of plants meant to look as if they naturally grew that way. This type of yard evokes the 19th century pastoral style championed in America by Frederick Law Olmsted, who was himself inspired by the 18th century English landscape movement. The goal was to create an idealized version of nature with plenty of open space to frame a magnificent naturalistic scene. Our suburban version is a bit more humble, but the idea is the same. A lawn that kind of sets the stage for a pleasing and natural looking arrangement of shrubs and trees. So let's take a look at the fictional house for our nature-inspired front yard. The area we're going to transform is about 25 by 30, let's say. We are again starting with a pretty vanilla front yard, but we're going to transform this into a beautiful and ecologically front yard that is still 100% suburb approved. Now, a traditional landscape that's aiming to look natural would probably make this bed in front a little bit bigger with a curving shape to look more natural. They'd probably add an attractive tree and some shrubs, then maybe a few perennials to add some interest in front of that. But I think you can probably guess where this is going. For our wildlife-friendly, naturalistic yard, we're going to make the beds a whole lot bigger, like half the front yard and that entire side yard. This area is really shady, and if we're being honest with ourselves, the grass won't grow well there anyhow. It's not the right plant for that spot, even in a traditional yard. So that whole area can be replaced with something that's going to do a lot more heavy lifting. Doug Tallamy often says that if everyone planted 70% of their yard with natives, we'd be creating enough habitat in human landscapes to support wildlife in a really meaningful way. And good news, we are absolutely going to get to that number by creating really generous planting beds and filling them with natives that have high value for wildlife. I'm going to pretend this yard is mostly part shade so that I can offer some part shade plant ideas here, since our first yard featured full sun plants. I'm starting by laying out where the bigger structural plants will go. I'm thinking a tree will be really nice here in front. I've picked Amelanchier arborea, also known as serviceberry or juneberry, which has lovely white flowers in spring and delicious berries if the birds don't eat them all first, and beautiful orange-red fall color. On the other side, I'm going to put an oak leaf hydrangea, which is actually a pretty common plant in traditional landscape design, but it's actually native to a lot of the eastern US. I'm also adding in 3 red twig dogwoods. In design, there's this rule of thumb that odd numbers of things look better. It's not a hard and fast rule, but if in doubt, go with an odd number. These shrubs can get big, but my plan here is to maintain them by cutting out the older branches every few years, because it's actually the newer branches that have that wonderful red color. And that's also going to keep them smaller, which is what I'm going for this plan. I think we should also add a path to the back gate over here. It's going to be, obviously, for gate access, but also for easier access to maintain the planting, as well as an attractive feature to add some definition over here to this bed. I think it would be really beautiful to interplant the stones with Sedum ternatum, which is a ground-hugging native stone crop with pretty little white flowers. I'm not going to take too much time here with the side yard, but I think I might add a few winterberry shrubs, which can take some shade and have really beautiful berries in the winter, and maybe some dwarf honeysuckle, and then fill in with some woodland perennials that can handle the shade. Let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in a video on natives for shade. Coming back to the front yard, I want to include some areas of mixed plantings, but also have some areas that are blocks of just one kind of plant. These areas are going to help make the design look more cohesive and more attractive. I'm also going to focus on perennials that are less than 3 feet tall so that things stay tidy looking. Starting on the right side, I'm adding a matrix planting over on the side of the bed. We can make it fairly large without overwhelming the appearance of the yard. I'm planting a mix of little bluestem and bottlebrush grass for the grasses, as well as white prairie clover, world milkweed, calico asters, and zigzag goldenrod. I always include some kind of aster and goldenrod in any design. They're super beneficial for wildlife. These plants will be around 2.5 feet tall, and there will only be 1 or 2 colors in bloom at any time. So the effect will be sort of a curated mini meadow. I'm including a few Echinacea pallida for architectural interest as well. And then maybe toward the back of this area into the shade, we can add some Joe Pye weed. It can get really tall, but back here, I think it's going to look great, and it's a pollinator favorite. With a naturalistic design, the goal is balance rather than symmetry, so we don't need a mirror image of this matrix on the other side, but we should definitely think about how we'll balance each side of this planting. So I think I'll add another matrix patch on that side to balance things out, and now I want to add some larger blocks of plants that will read as a little more intentional in the design. I think that a really pretty native that doesn't get enough use is Jacob's Ladder. It's very short, so I'm going to put it in the front here by the path where people can really enjoy it. It's got lavender flowers in the spring, but the foliage is pretty all season long. Again, balancing it throughout the design and striving to repeat it 3 times. Another really nice one for part shade is prairie alum root, or Euchera richardsonii. Prairie alum root gives lovely texture in a really subtly beautiful way. And next, I want to work in some Monarda bradburyana. I think this is a totally underrated native. It blooms in spring and early summer, but the seed heads are just as lovely after the flowers are gone. And it's only about 2 to 3 feet tall. Gorgeous. And finally, I think I want to tuck in some sedges, maybe something a little taller and showier like Carex springellii. I might also add some shorter species like Carex rosea or radiata. And I'll just do that kind of in and around the shrubs just to keep some moisture in the soil. And that gives us something like this. I tried to choose plants here that work in part shade and medium soil, but every site is different. And even within your yard, there might be places where a plant will do better or worse. But I think that can actually be an advantage rather than a problem. You can think about putting plants that need moisture, for example, right next to your downspout. I think that's part of the fun and challenge of gardening, learning what plants need, where they want to be, and how they're going to behave in different settings. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much, and please subscribe so you don't miss part 3. I'll be talking about using natives alongside our favorite exotic garden plants and how you can start to incorporate natives gradually into an existing garden. Thanks. See you next time.